Today I'm going to talk to you about biomembranes. Make sure you have a piece of paper out and you're able to take notes with me. If you feel like you missed something, you can record the video or pause the video and move on. You've probably never heard biomembranes called biomembranes before. You may have heard biomembranes called the cell membrane or the endoplasmic reticulum. The word biomembrane is any membrane that's made up of a phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins. Biomembranes can be internal membranes as well as external membranes. So let's talk about some examples of biomembranes. All right? And let's talk about the structure. So for the structure of a biomembrane, we're going to start with phospholipids. Remember, there's the phosphate head and the fatty acid tails. The cool thing about a biomembrane is it not only allows a cell to maintain homeostasis, it also allows us to review macromolecules. So when we think about a biomembrane, okay, the first thing we're talking about are phospholipids. And remember, a phospholipid fits into the lipid category because of these fatty acid tails. There are two fatty acid tails, one's bent to prevent the membrane from freezing solid, and one is not. There's a phosphate head, and there's even a glycerol in here. Remember, for phospholipids, the phosphate heads of the phospholipid are hydrophilic. So there's two sides of the phospholipid bilayer that contain hydrophilic components. Then the fatty acid tails, right here, are hydrophobic, which is why they hide on the inside of the bilayer. The reason phospholipids form a bilayer is because the phosphate heads like to be near water, so they're near the outside, whereas the fatty acid tails hide on the inside of the membrane. So here are fatty acid tails. Another important thing to remember about phospholipids is that one of the tails is bent, again, to prevent the membranes from freezing solid. Because of the structure of these biomembranes, nonpolar molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide, they're small and nonpolar, can easily get through a membrane. So this is part of a biomembrane, and so far we've only talked about one component of a biomembrane, which is a phospholipid, which comes into the lipid category. Another component that you'll find in the biomembrane is an embedded protein. There are many different kinds of proteins that you'll find in biomembranes. And you can find examples of these in the book reading that I've asked you to do that talks to you about membrane proteins. Membrane proteins are really interesting. Of course, if you zoomed in, you would find that these membrane proteins are made up of amino acids. And this protein is probably in tertiary or quaternary structure. Now remember, this protein is surrounded by phospholipids. So we'll draw more phospholipids. And the only way this protein can fit into the membrane is if it itself has hydrophobic and hydrophilic parts. So I'm going to make a quick key for you. The amino acids that I make purple, okay, are going to be hydrophilic. Okay, just like the phosphate heads of a phospholipid. The amino acids that I draw green are going to be hydrophobic. So the only way a protein can fit into the cell membrane is if it matches the phospholipids around it. So if we think about it that way, we know that the phosphate heads are hydrophilic. They like to be near water. That means that they might be polar. The phosphate heads are going to be near water, but that means that the amino acids that are near those phosphate heads should be polar, so they can also be near water. Okay, and they're going to be hydrophilic. So these purple amino acids are polar. So this part of the protein that is near the water and is also near the phosphate heads is going to be made up of polar amino acids. The amino acids that are on the inside of the protein near the fatty acid tails are most likely going to be nonpolar, so that they match with the hydrophobic fatty acid tails. So the way proteins embed themselves in the membrane is they put polar amino acids near the part of the cell membrane that is hydrophilic, the phosphate heads, and they put nonpolar amino acids in the middle of the protein that's going to interact with the fatty acid tails. So that's how it sticks into the membrane. Okay. So far we're reviewing two macromolecules. We have phospholipids, which are a type of lipid made up of glycerol, a phosphate head, and fatty acid tails, and we have a protein. There's another type of lipid that also fits into the cell membrane, and that's cholesterol. And cholesterol is a type of steroid. So cholesterol is a ring structure that embeds itself into the cell membrane, and again, make sure that the cell membrane is fluid, or the internal membranes are fluid, and they don't pack together and freeze. So far we have two lipids that we can find in the cell membrane. We have cholesterol, which is a lipid, and we have phospholipids, which are also lipids. So two examples of lipids. We have an example of one type of protein in the cell membrane, and the protein type is an embedded protein. Okay, there are other proteins in the cell membrane, and again, when you read chapter 5, you'll learn more about those. We also can sometimes have carbohydrates in membranes. So some proteins actually have carbohydrate groups that stick off of them. And these carbohydrate groups allow for this cell to be recognized by other cells. So sometimes there's like little polysaccharides that stick off a protein. This protein is no longer just called a protein. Now it's called a glycoprotein because it has a protein component and it has a carbohydrate component. So you can actually find 3 of the 4 macromolecules in membrane structures themselves. So this is a very generic structure of a membrane. Membranes become specialized depending on where they're located and what they're doing. You'll find different proteins in the membrane. You'll find different amounts of cholesterol in the membrane. And this varies across kingdoms, the animal kingdom, plants, protists, fungi, archaebacteria, eubacteria. You'll find different membrane structures, but they'll have the same basic parts. Okay? Another important thing to know about membranes is we're not just talking about the cell membrane. So for example, if we're looking at a bacteria, or if we're looking at an animal cell, okay, a bacteria is only made up of one big bag of material. Okay, and I'm going to color code this. I'm going to say purple equals biomembrane. So bacteria has a biomembrane on the outside called its cell membrane or plasma membrane. Okay, and this cell membrane is made up of phospholipids with embedded proteins. And this goes all the way around the cell. Animal cells also have a cell membrane. However, animal cell membrane is not the only membrane that they have. So here's your animal cell membrane. Which is also made up of a phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins. And this bilayer would go around the entire cell. But animal cells have internal membranes as well. So the cell membrane for both of these is considered their external membranes. And animal cells have internal membranes as well, which we call their eukaryotic organelles, their membrane-bound organelles. So we have the nuclear membrane, which is also known as a biomembrane because it's also made up of phospholipids all the way around. You have our ER, our endoplasmic reticulum, which is also a biomembrane, made up of a phospholipid bilayer. Okay? You have the Golgi, which is also made up of a phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins. You have lysosomes, which is also made of a phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins. So all of these are considered internal membranes, but they're still biomembranes because they are made up of phospholipid bilayers with embedded proteins. So all of those that have underlined in pink, these are internal membranes. So as you can see from the bacteria, it only has an external membrane and no internal membranes, whereas an animal cell has the external cell membrane as well as internal membrane structures, like the nuclear membrane, the ER, the Golgi, the lysosome. We'll talk about the mitochondria, etc. later. And obviously, all of these membrane-bound organelles have specific functions. These functions are also carried out in bacteria. However, they just happen in the cytoplasm or on infoldings of the cell membrane because bacteria don't have these internal membranes. So that's the end of part 1 on biomembranes.